October 12, 1944. A dirt road somewhere in eastern Pennsylvania. The wind moved slow through the cornstalks, bending them in long, golden waves that stretched to the horizon. The air smelled of turned earth and diesel fuel. A convoy of olive-drab trucks rumbled past white farmhouses with wide porches, past red barns where the paint had faded into something softer than memory. Inside the canvas-covered beds of those trucks sat men in Feldgrau uniforms, officers of the Wehrmacht, their tunics still bearing the dust of Normandy, their eyes hollow from the crossing. They had expected many things when they surrendered to American forces 3 months prior. Humiliation, certainly. Deprivation, perhaps. Execution was not impossible, but none of them. Not Hauptmann Ernst Wöller, not Oberleutnant Klaus Friedrichs, not any of the 43 German officers packed into those trucks, expected to smell roasting, chicken drifting through the October air as the convoy slowed near a farmstead. Just outside Gettysburg, the trucks stopped. An American lieutenant with a clipboard stepped down and spoke briefly with a farmer standing by a fence post. A man in his 60s, suspenders over a faded shirt, hands like worn leather. The farmer nodded. He looked toward the trucks without hatred, without joy, with something closer to resignation or duty. He turned and walked toward his house. The German officers watched him go, confused. Within the hour, they would sit at long wooden tables in a barn that still smelled of hay and livestock, and they would eat a meal that would fracture something fundamental in their understanding of war, of enemies, of the world itself. This is not a story of kindness. It is not a story of forgiveness. It is a story of abundance meeting ideology, of American pragmatism colliding with European totalism, and of how a simple dinner on a Pennsylvania farm could unravel years of propaganda more effectively than any bomb or bullet ever could. By the autumn of 1944, the United States held more than 370,000 Axis prisoners of war on its soil, a number that would swell past 425,000 by war's end. They were housed in over 500 camps scattered across the American interior, far from the coasts, far from strategic targets, placed in the great empty heartland where space was abundant and escape was futile. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required signatories to treat prisoners humanely, to feed them adequately, to house them in conditions no worse than their own troops. The United States, possessing both the resources and the bureaucratic earnestness to follow international law, took this obligation seriously. But what adequately meant in a nation untouched by bombs, blessed with vast agricultural output, and driven by industrial surplus, was something no German officer could have imagined from within the Third Reich. In Germany, the war had arrived like a constricting fist. Rationing began in August 1939, the very month the war started. Meat, butter, sugar, coffee, all were controlled, measured, distributed according to Byzantine systems of coupons and classifications. By 1942, the rations had tightened further. By 1944, German civilians subsisted on 1,600 calories per day if they were lucky, often less. Frontline soldiers received better provisions, but even they knew the taste of ersatz coffee made from acorns, of bread stretched with sawdust and potato flour, of margarine that was more water than fat. The officers being transported through Pennsylvania had spent years in a world where scarcity was the governing principle of existence, where every resource was calculated, hoarded, weaponized. They had been told that Germany fought for survival, that the enemies surrounding the Reich intended its utter annihilation, that the Americans and British and Soviets lived in decadence while German children starved. And then they arrived in America. The crossing itself was disorienting. Packed into the holds of Liberty ships, they had expected the voyage to be brutal. Some had heard rumors of prisoners thrown overboard, of starvation aboard transport vessels, of Allied revenge. Instead, they were fed twice daily: canned stew, bread, occasionally fruit. The Red Cross inspected the ships. American guards were distant, but not cruel. When the vessels docked in New York or Boston or Norfolk, the prisoners caught glimpses of a skyline untouched by war, of cranes lifting cargo in vast mechanical ballets, of lights burning without fear of bombers. The cognitive dissonance began there, at the docks, but it deepened once they moved inland. The camps themselves were Spartan, but functional. Barracks with cots and stoves, latrines that worked, medical staff who treated illness without ideology, and the food, always the food. Breakfast might include oatmeal, toast, jam, powdered eggs. Lunch brought soup, sandwiches, sometimes canned vegetables. Dinner was meat, potatoes, bread, butter, coffee, real coffee. By the standards of the Geneva Convention, this was adequate. By the standards of wartime Germany, it was incomprehensible. Oberleutnant Klaus Friedrichs would later write in a letter smuggled through Red Cross channels, "We eat better here as prisoners than we did as victors in France." The line was bleak, bitter, and true, but eating in a camp mess hall, surrounded by other prisoners and watched by guards, was one thing. Eating in a farmhouse, as a guest, was something else entirely. The practice of using prisoner labor on American farms was born of necessity, not charity. By 1943, the agricultural labor shortage had become acute. Millions of young men were in uniform. War industries absorbed much of the remaining workforce. Crops rotted in fields, orchards went unpicked. The government, pressured by agricultural lobbies and driven by the need to sustain both civilian morale and Allied supply lines, authorized the use of POW labor under strict guidelines. Prisoners could not displace American workers. They could not work in industries directly related to war production. They had to be compensated, paid a nominal wage in scrip that could be used in camp canteens. And they had to be treated in accordance with international law. Farmers who used POW labor were required to provide adequate meals during the workday. In practice, this often meant that prisoners ate alongside farmhands, or in barns, or at outdoor tables set up near the fields. Some farmers complied grudgingly, viewing the Germans or Italians as enemies barely tolerated. Others, particularly in rural areas where labor was desperately scarce and old-world grudges felt distant, treated the prisoners as they would any hired hand, with a kind of transactional decency rooted in pragmatism rather than sentiment. And then there were the families who invited them to dinner. It did not happen often. It was not official policy. In some regions, it was actively discouraged by camp administrators wary of fraternization. But it happened enough that letters, diaries, and post-war interviews are scattered with references to the practice. German and Italian prisoners sitting at American dinner tables, eating home-cooked meals, sometimes making halting conversation in broken English. Sometimes sitting in near silence while children stared and wives served food and farmers made terse comments about the weather or the harvest. For the American families, the motivations varied. Some were Christian, driven by scriptural commands to feed the hungry and love one's enemies. Some were practical, believing that well-fed workers were more productive. Some were simply lonely, their own sons overseas, their tables too quiet. And some carried the immigrant memory of Europe in their bones. German surnames, grandparents who spoke the old language, a complicated identification that made the enemy soldiers seem less foreign, more tragically familiar. For the German officers, the experience was destabilizing in ways that had nothing to do with kindness and everything to do with the collapse of narrative. Hauptmann Ernst Willer had been a company commander in the 352nd Infantry Division, one of the units that defended Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. He was 32 years old, a career officer, educated, capable, a man who believed in duty and discipline and the necessity of Germany's struggle. He had joined the Wehrmacht in 1935 before the madness fully metastasized, and he had told himself over the years that he was a soldier, not a politician, that his oath was to the nation, not the party. It was a convenient fiction, and he knew it, but it allowed him to function. He had been wounded at Normandy, shrapnel in the leg, not life-threatening but enough to slow him down. His unit was overrun in the breakout from the Bocage. He surrendered on August 17, 1944, near Argentan, along with thousands of others. He expected to die in a field somewhere. Instead, he was processed, tagged, transported to England, then shipped to the United States. By October, he was in Pennsylvania, assigned to a work detail harvesting apples in an orchard outside Gettysburg. The farmer's name was Samuel Brenneman. His family had worked the land since the 1780s. He was a Mennonite, though not strictly observant, and he had lost a son at Anzio. He did not speak of it. When the camp liaison officer asked if he would accept POW labor, Brenneman agreed without ceremony. When the prisoners arrived, He treated them with the same gruff efficiency he applied to his machinery, useful if maintained, replaceable if broken. But on the second Sunday of October, Brenneman's wife, Miriam, told her husband that she had cooked too much and it would spoil. There were 12 prisoners working the orchard that week. She suggested they stay for supper. Brenneman was silent for a long moment, then nodded. They work, they eat, he said. It was not sentiment, it was equation. The prisoners were brought to the barn as the sun descended behind the ridgeline. Long tables had been set with mismatched plates and tin cups. There was no ceremony. Miriam and her 2 daughters brought out platters of roast chicken, bowls of mashed potatoes, gravy, green beans cooked with bacon, fresh bread, butter, apple pie. The smell alone was a kind of violence. Ernst Willer sat at the far end of one table, his wounded leg stretched awkwardly to the side. He watched as the food was laid out, as the American guards stood back near the barn doors, as Samuel Brenneman said a brief, mumbled grace in English. Weller understood enough to know it was a prayer. He did not bow his head. When they began to eat, it was in silence. The taste of real chicken, not stringy, not preserved, but roasted with herbs and fat crisping the skin, was so overwhelming that several of the men stopped chewing, as if the act of swallowing would make it disappear. The bread was soft, the butter was real, the pie was warm. Willer found himself thinking of his mother's kitchen in Würzburg, of Sunday dinners before the war, of plenty that had once seemed ordinary. He thought of the last time he had eaten chicken, some requisitioned bird in Normandy, boiled tough, shared among 6 officers. He thought of the propaganda films he had seen, the ones that showed Americans as degenerate, weak, obsessed with material comfort, while Europe burned. He thought of the lectures about Jewish Bolshevik conspiracies, about the existential threat, about the necessity of total war. And here he sat, in a barn in Pennsylvania, eating a meal prepared by the wife of a man whose son he might have killed. Eating not out of kindness, but out of surplus, out of the simple, staggering fact that America had so much that even its enemies could be fed without sacrifice. It was not generosity, it was abundance. And abundance, Willer realized, was a kind of power that no ideology could contain. The American food supply during World War II was one of the quiet miracles of the conflict. While Europe starved and Asia burned, the United States increased its agricultural output to levels that seemed almost obscene. Between 1940 and 1945, American farms produced enough food to feed not only the domestic population, but also to supply the military, to sustain Britain through Lend-Lease, to provision Allied forces across multiple theaters, and to feed millions of prisoners of war. This was not accidental. It was the result of mechanization, of hybrid seeds and chemical fertilizers, of government subsidies and price supports, of a vast continental geography blessed with fertile soil and favorable climate. American farms were not peasant plots. They were industrial operations, and they functioned with a ruthless efficiency that was itself a form of warfare. For the German officers, many of whom came from rural backgrounds or had studied agriculture, the scale of American farming was both impressive and humiliating. They saw fields that stretched for miles without interruption. They saw tractors and combines that dwarfed anything in Europe. They saw waste, fruits left to rot because there was no market, milk dumped because prices were controlled, grain stored in silos so vast they seemed like cathedrals to surplus. One prisoner, a former agricultural engineer named Dieter Kohl, wrote in his diary, "They do not know hunger. They cannot. They waste more in a day than we see in a month. This is not virtue. It is geography. But it is also victory." The meals at farmhouses became, for many prisoners, a recurring symbol of that victory. The chicken on the plate was not merely food, it was evidence. It was the collapse of the narrative that Germany fought for survival against a starving, declining West. It was proof that the Reich had lied, or at least that it had been catastrophically wrong. Not all prisoners accepted this. Some clung to ideology even in the face of abundance. They argued that American wealth was stolen, built on exploitation, that it was temporary, that Germany's spiritual strength would outlast material decadence. These men were often Nazi true believers, party members who had internalized the doctrine so completely that no amount of chicken or pie could dislodge it. They sat at the tables and ate with resentment, viewing the food as a trick, a humiliation. a form of psychological warfare. But for others, men like Wöhler, men who had believed but not fanatically, men who had fought out of duty rather than conviction, the dinners were corrosive. They ate, and with each meal, the certainty crumbled a little more. There was a sound that recurred in Wöhler's memory of that evening, a sound that would stay with him for the rest of his life. It was the sound of Miriam Brenneman's daughter, a girl no older than 14, laughing. She had dropped a serving spoon, and it clattered against the floor, and she laughed, bright, unself-conscious, the kind of laugh that belonged to someone who had never known real fear. In Germany, children did not laugh like that anymore. By 1944, the Hitler Youth had become a grim, militarized pipeline to the front. Schools taught sacrifice and vengeance. Laughter, when it happened, was bitter or desperate. The sound of that girl's laugh was so alien to Wöhler that it took him a moment to recognize what it was. He looked around the barn and saw other signs of normalcy. The walls were hung with old tools, some rusted, some still used. There were feed sacks stacked in a corner. A cat wandered between the tables, utterly indifferent to the prisoners. Outside, through the open barn doors, the sun was setting in shades of amber and rose, and the fields rolled away into the distance, unbroken by craters or trenches or graves. This was a country at war, but the war had not touched it. Not here, not in any way that mattered. Wöhler thought of Berlin, of the ruins left by RAF bombing raids. He thought of the refugees streaming west from the Eastern Front, of cities evacuated, of ration cards that bought nothing because there was nothing to buy. He thought of the exhortations to hold out, to sacrifice, to believe in final victory even as the walls closed in. And he thought, we have already lost. Not because of this dinner, not because of kindness, but because a nation that could feed its enemies without even noticing the cost was a nation that could not be defeated. The war would continue. Men would die. Cities would burn. But the outcome was no longer in doubt, if it ever had been. That realization did not bring relief. It brought a kind of cold existential exhaustion. After the meal, Samuel Brenneman walked among the tables with a pot of coffee, refilling cups. He moved slowly, methodically, his face impassive. When he reached Wöhler, he paused and looked down at the German officer's leg, at the way it was stretched out stiffly. That healing? Brenneman asked. Wöhler understood the words, but took a moment to respond. Yes, he said. It is better. Brenneman nodded. He poured the coffee. Good, he said. Then he moved on. It was not warmth. It was not forgiveness. It was simply a man acknowledging another man's injury, the way he might acknowledge a broken axle or a lame horse. And yet for Wöhler it was unbearable. He would have preferred hatred. Hatred made sense. Hatred fit the world he knew. This practical, indifferent decency was something else. It denied him even the dignity of being a proper enemy. Later, as the prisoners were loaded back into the trucks, Wöhler looked back at the farmhouse. The lights were on inside. He could see shapes moving past the windows, Miriam clearing dishes, the daughters helping, Samuel sitting at the table with a newspaper. The war continued, but not for them. Not tonight. One of the other officers, a younger man named Hartmann, spoke quietly beside him. They fed us better than our own command did. Wöhler said nothing. Do you think they know? Hartmann continued. Do you think they understand what this does to us? Wöhler considered the question. No, he said finally. I do not think they think of it at all. And that, perhaps, was the most devastating part. The phenomenon of German prisoners being invited to American homes was not isolated to Pennsylvania. It happened in Texas, where ranchers fed Italian POWs barbecue and taught them to mend fences. It happened in Montana, where German prisoners worked sugar beet fields and were given Thanksgiving dinner by Lutheran families whose grandparents had emigrated from Bavaria. It happened in the orchards of Washington, the farms of Iowa, the logging camps of Minnesota. The results were documented by camp administrators, by Red Cross observers, by military intelligence officers who interviewed returning prisoners after the war. A common theme emerged: the experience of being treated not as subhuman enemies, but as laborers, as temporary inhabitants of a place that functioned according to rules utterly foreign to totalitarian Europe. So Antintili Dantitwayudriv had a profound psychological effect. Some prisoners became depressed. confronting the cognitive dissonance between propaganda and reality. Some became angry, lashing out at fellow prisoners who expressed doubt about the Nazi cause. Some became quiet, retreating into themselves, processing something they lacked the vocabulary to articulate. And some, like Ernst Wöhler, simply began to see the war differently, not as a crusade or a tragedy, but as a miscalculation, a bet placed by men who did not understand the nature of the opponent. Germany had gambled that it could outlast nations it viewed as decadent, and it had lost that gamble not on the battlefield, though it was losing there too, but in the simple, undeniable fact of American capacity. A German officer named Ludwig Fischer, captured in North Africa and sent to a camp in Arkansas, wrote in a letter, "They do not hate us because they do not need to. Hatred is a luxury of the desperate. They are not desperate." It was a keen observation. American propaganda during the war certainly trafficked in hatred. Posters depicting grotesque Japanese and German caricatures, speeches about the barbarism of the enemy. But on the ground, among civilians far from the fighting, the hatred was often abstract, obligatory, less felt than performed. The farmers who fed prisoners were not motivated by love of enemy. They were motivated by a kind of transactional humanism rooted in religious tradition, civic duty, and simple pragmatism. This was not morally superior. It was situational. America could afford decency because it was safe, because its cities were not being bombed, because its food supply was secure. Had the war come to American soil, had the farms of Pennsylvania been shelled and the orchards burned, the outcome might have been very different. But that was the point. The war had not come to American soil, and the fact that it could not, that the sheer distance and industrial power of the United States made invasion unthinkable, was itself a form of victory that no amount of ideology could overcome. As the autumn of 1944 gave way to winter, Ernst Wöhler continued to work in the orchards and fields around Gettysburg. The work was hard, but not brutal. The guards were professional. The food remained incomprehensibly plentiful. He began to learn English, haltingly, picking up phrases from the guards and the farmers. He read American newspapers that were made available in the camp, and censored, but still more informative than anything he had seen in Germany. He read about the liberation of Paris. He read about the advance into Belgium. He read about the bombing of German cities, about the Soviet offensive in the East. He read between the lines and understood that the war was entering its final, savage phase. And he thought about the dinner in the barn. It had not changed him in any dramatic sense. He did not become an anti-Nazi crusader. He did not renounce his past. But it had planted a question that he could not quite shake. If America could afford to feed its enemies, if it could fight a global war and still maintain abundance at home, if it could extend even a grudging, utilitarian decency to prisoners, what did that mean for the Germany he had believed in? He did not have an answer. He was not sure he wanted one. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the United States held over 425,000 Axis prisoners. The process of repatriation took years. Many prisoners did not want to return. Germany was destroyed, occupied, divided. Those who went back found a country unrecognizable, a landscape of rubble and starvation and shame. Ernst Wöhler returned to Würzburg in 1947. His mother had died during a bombing raid. His childhood home was rubble. He found work eventually, as many did, in the reconstruction. He married, had children, lived quietly. He did not speak much about the war. When asked, he would say he had been captured in France and spent the rest of the war in America. He did not elaborate, but once, near the end of his life, he told his grandson a story. He described a barn in Pennsylvania, a dinner with roast chicken and apple pie, a girl laughing over a dropped spoon. He described the taste of real butter, the smell of fresh bread, the disorienting kindness that was not kindness of a farmer whose son had died in Italy. "I think that was the moment I understood we had lost," he said. "Not because they were stronger, but because they did not need to hate us to defeat us. His grandson asked what he meant. Willer was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "They had enough." "We never did." That was the whole war. The chicken dinners of 1944 were not acts of heroism. They were not moments of moral clarity. They were small, transactional events driven by labor shortages and religious tradition and the peculiar pragmatism of rural America. But they were also something more. They were demonstrations of a kind of power that totalitarian regimes could not comprehend. The power of surplus, of security, of a society that functioned not by grinding its people into ideological purity, but by producing so much that even its enemies could be fed without sacrifice. For the German officers who sat at those tables, the experience was not about kindness. It was about confronting the collapse of a worldview. They had been told that Germany fought for survival, that the enemies at the gates were decadent and weak, that willpower and sacrifice would triumph over material wealth. And then they crossed the ocean and found a nation so abundant that it could afford to treat its prisoners better than Germany treated its own soldiers. This was not a kindness. It was a refutation. The dinners did not end the war. They did not change history, but they changed men. They planted doubts, fractured certainties, made the propaganda harder to believe. In the decades after the war, as Germany rebuilt and reckoned with its past, those small moments in Pennsylvania barns and Iowa kitchens became part of a larger story, the story of how ideology met reality and lost. There is a photograph, taken sometime in the autumn of 1944, that survives in a private collection. It shows a group of German prisoners standing in an orchard, apple crates stacked behind them. They are not smiling, but they are not broken either. They look like men doing work, ordinary and exhausted. In the background, barely visible, is the shape of a farmhouse, its windows glowing in the late afternoon light. It is not a dramatic photograph. There are no heroes in it, no villains, no moments of revelation. Just men and land and the quiet, relentless turning of seasons. But if you look closely, on the ground near the edge of the frame, there is a dropped apple. It lies in the grass, bruised but whole, left behind because there were so many others, because one apple more or less made no difference. That is the image that endures, not the kindness, not the forgiveness, but the apple, abandoned in the grass, a small symbol of the abundance that won the war more surely than any battle. And somewhere, in a farmhouse or a barn, the smell of roasting chicken still lingers in memory. A ghost of plenty, a reminder that some wars are lost, not on the field, but at the table. In the quiet realization that the enemy never needed to hate you to destroy you. They only needed to have enough.